The night it happened, most people walking past the old subway entrance barely noticed the boy sitting on a broken milk crate beneath a flickering streetlight, because cities teach you early how to look without seeing, how to step over stories instead of into them. Yet if you had slowed your pace by even a second, you would have seen the way his fingers hovered above the battered acoustic guitar like they were afraid of waking it, the way his shoulders were too narrow for the oversized jacket hanging off them, the way his eyes, dark, alert, and far older than his face, kept scanning the street not for applause but for danger, because life had taught him that kindness was rarer than cruelty and survival came before dreams. And this boy, whose name was Eli though almost no one ever asked, had slept the last 3 nights behind a closed-down laundromat with cardboard for insulation in a sky full of sirens instead of stars. And music was the one thing that still made him feel human, the one thing that reminded him he was more than another statistic, more than another kid people crossed the street to avoid. And that night, with the cold pressing into his bones and hunger gnawing like an animal inside his stomach, he took a breath, pressed his fingers to the strings, and began to play the opening chords of Hotel California, not because it was trendy or because he thought it would bring him money, but because his mother used to hum it softly when they still had an apartment and electricity and hope, back before addiction hollowed her out and the system failed them both. And as the melody spilled into the air, it carried with it a strange stillness, like the city itself leaned in to listen, and people slowed, some out of curiosity, some out of annoyance, until the boy opened his mouth and sang. And that was the moment everything changed, because his voice was not what anyone expected. It wasn't polished or trained in the way professionals sounded, but it was raw and aching and honest, the kind of voice that didn't ask permission to be felt, the kind that carried pain and longing and resilience in every note. And as he sang about a dark desert highway and cool wind in his hair, the words seemed to twist and reshape themselves around his life, turning the song into a confession, a memory, a warning, and a prayer all at once. And a woman in a business suit stopped mid-stride, her phone forgotten in her hand, because something in his voice reminded her of the brother she'd lost years ago, and a construction worker leaned against a lamppost, wiping his eyes with the back of his glove, and a pair of tourists lowered their camera because no photograph could capture what they were feeling, and none of them knew that just a few blocks away, inside a renovated community arts center, a group of professional musicians, session guitarists, vocal coaches, producers who had worked with chart-topping artists, were wrapping up a workshop on technical excellence, debating tone and breath control and marketability, when one of them, a graying producer named Marcus Hale who had spent 3 decades in studios and thought he'd heard every voice worth hearing, caught a fragment of the melody drifting through an open window, and something in it made him pause mid-sentence, because it wasn't perfect, but it was true, and truth has a way of cutting through expertise like a blade. So he walked toward the sound, his colleagues following out of curiosity, and as they reached the street corner they saw the boy, small against the city, pouring everything he had into the song, and one by one the professionals fell silent, because no amount of training had prepared them for the way his voice cracked not from weakness but from emotion, the way he leaned into the chorus like it was holding him upright, the way the crowd around him grew thicker, quieter, reverent, as if they all understood they were witnessing something sacred. And when he reached the line about being a prisoner of his own device, his eyes flicked upward, not at the crowd but at the buildings towering over him, and in that instant Marcus saw not a street kid but an artist, a human being whose life had been shaped by forces far beyond his control. And when the final note faded, there was a heartbeat of silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing, and then applause erupted, not the polite kind but the kind that comes from somewhere deep and uncontrollable, hands clapping, voices cheering, some people crying openly, and Eli flinched at first because he wasn't used to being celebrated, only tolerated at best, ignored at worst, and he lowered his head, mumbling a soft thank you, already bracing himself for the moment when the crowd would move on and the night would swallow him again. But instead Marcus stepped forward, not with a contract or a camera, but with a simple question spoken gently so it wouldn't sound like a trap. "What's your name, kid?" And Eli hesitated, because names had power, and he'd learned not to give pieces of himself away easily, but something in the man's eyes felt different, less hungry, more human. So he answered, and Marcus nodded like he was committing it to memory, like it mattered, and said, "You've got something special. Not just talent, heart." And one of the vocal coaches, a woman who had trained contestants on national television, wiped her eyes and added, "You made me feel something I forgot I needed to feel." And for a moment Eli didn't know what to do with those words, because praise without a catch felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous, and then a woman from the crowd stepped forward and placed a folded bill into his guitar case, followed by another, and another, until the case was heavy with more money than Eli had seen in weeks, and he felt a strange mix of gratitude and shame, because he didn't want pity, he wanted dignity, and Marcus seemed to sense that, because he raised a hand and said, "This isn't charity. This is appreciation," and that distinction mattered more than anyone realized, and as the crowd slowly dispersed, buzzing with the energy of what they'd just witnessed, Marcus crouched down so he was eye level with Eli and asked where he was staying, and Eli's shoulders tensed, because that question usually led to judgment or intervention that made things worse, but honesty slipped out before fear could stop it, and when he finished, there was no lecture, no savior complex, just a quiet nod and an offer, "Come by the Arts Center tomorrow." No promises. Just music. Food, too, and Eli almost laughed, because hope had burned him before, but as Marcus stood and handed him a card, something small and fragile sparked in his chest, and the next day, after a night spent staring at the card like it might disappear, Eli showed up, expecting rejection, but instead he was greeted with warmth, a sandwich, and a room full of instruments, and for the first time in years, he felt safe enough to close his eyes while he sang. And over the weeks that followed, the professionals who had been left speechless by his street performance didn't try to mold him into something he wasn't. They listened, they guided, they taught him the language of music without erasing his accent of pain. And the unexpected turn wasn't that he got famous overnight or signed a record deal, because real transformation rarely looks like that. It was that people, busy, accomplished, comfortable people, began to change, too, because helping Eli forced them to confront the ways they'd insulated themselves from suffering, and they started a program at the center for kids like him, not as a publicity move but as a commitment, and Eli, who had once believed the world had no room for him, found himself standing on a small stage months later, not under a flickering streetlight but under warm lights, singing Hotel California again, this time to an audience that included teachers, donors, former skeptics, and other street kids watching from the wings with wide eyes, and when he finished, the applause was just as loud, but what mattered more was the look on his face. Not triumph, not pride, but something quieter and deeper, belonging, and as Marcus watched from the side, he understood that the miracle wasn't just a street kid leaving professionals speechless, it was compassion breaking through indifference, it was humanity remembering itself, and the story spread, not as a viral clip stripped of context, but as a reminder whispered from person to person that greatness can come from the most overlooked places, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can give isn't money or expertise but attention and respect. And years later, when Eli would tell his own students about the night everything changed, he wouldn't talk about the applause or the professionals or even the song, he would talk about the moment someone asked his name and meant it, because that was the act of kindness that transformed a performance into a life, and left everyone who heard it, on that street and beyond, feeling a little more hopeful about the world they shared.